In the neon-drenched studios of Paramount on West 44th Street, a seemingly past his prime action star was about to face televised humiliation. What began as another late-night roast turned deadly serious when Mason Callahan's cruel mockery met something immovable. Steven Seagal wasn't your typical Hollywood has-been. For over 3 decades, he was a legitimate martial artist and teacher, known for transforming broken spirits into unbreakable warriors through discipline and compassion. When Callahan unleashed his arsenal of calculated cruelty and viral-worthy putdowns, he had no idea he was facing a master of a different kind of combat. Seagal responded with something the cynical host had never encountered: quiet dignity that would trigger a complete transformation of everyone in that studio. What began as manufactured entertainment would become a masterclass in true strength. The Manhattan television landscape would never be the same after one aging warrior reminded a room full of mockers what real heroism looked like. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Manhattan skyline blazed with electric ambition, and nowhere was that hunger for attention more concentrated than inside Paramount Studios on West 44th Street. Tonight, the neon-drenched facade announced in bold, pulsing letters: The Mason Callahan Show Live, no-holds-barred roast of old-school action stars. The promise of viral-worthy mockery drew crowds like moths to flame, their phones already primed to capture whatever carnage would unfold. Inside Studio B, chaos reigned in the controlled way only television could orchestrate. Cables snaked across polished floors like arteries feeding the beast of entertainment. Camera operators adjusted their angles with military precision while lighting technicians fine-tuned the harsh glare that would transform ordinary people into pixels on millions of screens. The air hummed with the electric tension of live broadcast preparation. Mason Callahan stood center stage in his green room, rolling his shoulders like a prize fighter preparing for battle. At 32, he possessed the kind of manufactured confidence that came from viral fame and network backing. His perfectly styled hair caught the harsh fluorescent lights as he rehearsed his opening monologue, each gesture calculated for maximum impact. The mirror reflected back a man who had built his career on the rubble of others' reputations. "Did you see this compilation?" Mason called to his phone, scrolling through a video titled, "When Movie Tough Guys Get Old and Desperate." His laugh was sharp, predatory. Steven Seagal trying to kick in that last movie. It's like watching a penguin attempt ballet. This is comedy gold, pure viral gold. 3 floors below, in the green-walled makeup room, Priya Rao shuffled through her notes with increasing unease. The former international correspondent had joined Mason's show hoping to bring nuance to his often chaotic approach, but segments like tonight's tested her moral boundaries. She'd read the script 3 times, each pass leaving her more uncomfortable with the mean-spirited tone. "Mason," she said, catching him between takes, "some of these men are genuine legends. They've accomplished more than most people dream of. Maybe we could balance the humor with some respect for their actual achievements?" Mason waved dismissively, his attention already back on his phone. Sure, but that was then. This is now. And now they're walking punchlines. The audience wants blood, Priya. They want to see giants fall. It's human nature. Is it though? Priya murmured, but Mason was already moving on, practicing his signature smirk in the mirror. Down in the bowels of the studio, Dante Miller moved through his domain with the meticulous precision of a master conductor. As stage manager, he was the invisible heartbeat of every production, coordinating lights, cameras, and crew with the kind of quiet competence that kept the machine running. His radio crackled constantly with updates from camera operators, sound technicians, and the booth upstairs. "Camera 3, I need you tight on the host's face during the Seagal bit." He spoke into his headset, checking his clipboard. "And remember, people, we're looking for genuine audience reactions. The algorithm loves authentic responses." Dante had worked these kinds of shows for 15 years, shepherding countless productions from concept to broadcast. He supported his elderly mother in Queens, sent money to his sister's kids in college, and dreamed of directing stage plays. Real theater that elevated the human spirit rather than dissecting it for entertainment. But television paid the bills, and bills were relentless. 30 minutes to air, he announced to his crew. Places, everyone. And remember, stay alert for anything unexpected. Live TV is a wild animal. In the concession area outside the studio, Steven Seagal moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned to find peace in any environment. At 68, he carried himself with understated confidence, his weathered face bearing the lines of someone who'd lived through genuine challenges. He wore a simple black jacket over a white shirt, a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Nothing that would draw attention in a city full of characters. "Just a water, thanks," he said to the young woman behind the counter, his voice soft but clear. She handed him the bottle with a shy smile, unaware she was serving a man who had once commanded movie screens worldwide. "You here for the show?" she asked, making small talk. "Something like that," Steven replied, his eyes kind but distant. "Should be interesting." He'd come tonight on a personal invitation from the show's executive producer, a man who'd grown up with Steven's movies and claimed he wanted to honor the legacy of action cinema. Steven had his doubts about the honesty of that claim, but curiosity had drawn him here. Sometimes the most important lessons came from the most unexpected places. Making his way to the studio floor, Steven found his assigned seat in the third row, slightly left of center. The audience buzzed around him with the electric anticipation of live television. Most were young, hungry for the kind of viral moments that would dominate their social feeds. A few older faces dotted the crowd, nostalgic fans who remembered when action movies were built on practical effects and genuine charisma rather than computer graphics and marketing campaigns. Near the front, Isabella Izzy Martinez clutched her dojo bag nervously, her eyes bright with anticipation. At 17, she carried herself with the quiet determination of someone who'd fought real battles. The small patch on her bag read, "Sunrise Martial Arts," the dojo that had become her second home during her recovery from leukemia. Her sensei had surprised her with tickets to tonight's show, knowing her admiration for the martial arts legends who'd inspired her to push through the darkest moments of her treatment. "I can't believe we're actually here," she whispered to her friend Maria, who sat beside her with equally wide eyes. "These guys were like superheroes when I was growing up." "We're being the operative phrase," Maria replied with a giggle. "I saw the previews online. Mason's going to destroy them." Izzy's expression flickered with uncertainty. Something about the promise of destruction felt wrong, like watching someone tear down a monument just to prove they could. But she pushed the feeling aside, caught up in the excitement of the moment. The warm-up comedian finished his routine, to scattered applause, and the stage lights dimmed to their pre-show positions. The audience settled into their seats with the trained enthusiasm of people who knew they were part of the show. Phones emerged like a field of glowing flowers, ready to capture every moment for instant upload to social media. Steven remained, still among the motion, his hands folded quietly in his lap, his eyes fixed on the stage with the analytical gaze of someone accustomed to reading situations and people. He'd spent decades learning to see beyond surfaces to understand the difference between performance and truth. Tonight, he sensed, would test that understanding in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. The red lights blazed to life, and Mason Callahan stepped into the spotlight, his trademark grin flashing like a blade in the artificial sun. The audience erupted in carefully orchestrated applause, their energy feeding the cameras that would carry this moment to millions of screens across the country. But in the third row, Steven Seagal sat perfectly still, watching and waiting, carrying within him a story that would transform everything. The opening theme exploded through the studio speakers, a driving electronic beat that seemed designed to raise heart rates and lower inhibitions. Mason Callahan strutted onto the stage like a conquering emperor, his arms spread wide to embrace the roaring applause. The audience responded with the trained enthusiasm of people who knew they were part of the show, their phones capturing every moment for instant upload to social media. "Good evening, America." Mason's voice boomed across the airwaves, his trademark grin gleaming under the harsh stage lights. "Welcome to the Mason Callahan Show, where we dive deep into the culture that shapes our world. I'm your host, Mason Callahan, joined as always by the brilliant Priya Rao." Priya waved to the camera from her position at the sleek co-host desk, her smile professional but strained. She could feel the weight of what was coming, The inevitable moment when Mason's boundless confidence would collide with something immovable. Her notes felt heavy in her hands, filled with research about the genuine accomplishments of the men Mason was about to savage. Tonight, Mason continued, pacing the stage with predatory energy. We're taking a trip back to the golden age of action movies. You know, when plots were simple, explosions were practical, and heroes solved everything with their fists. The audience laughed on cue, their phones capturing every gesture. Now, I love these movies as much as anyone. But let's be honest, some of these so-called martial arts masters have aged about as gracefully as milk in the sun. Behind the cameras, Dante Miller watched his monitors with growing unease. The social media metrics were spiking exactly. As predicted, shares, likes, and comments flooding in as viewers tuned in for the promised carnage. Professionally, he should have been satisfied. The show was delivering exactly what it promised. But something in his gut twisted as he watched. Mason's performance, the way the host's eyes glittered with cruel anticipation. Let's start with Steven Seagal, Mason announced, clicking a remote that brought up a montage of clips on the massive screen behind him. Now, I don't want to say Steven's gotten slow, but his last fight scene needed 3 stunt doubles and a nap break. The audience erupted in laughter as doctored footage played, showing Steven's more recent movies edited for maximum comedic effect. In the third row, Steven Seagal remained perfectly still, his weathered face unreadable. His eyes never left Mason's face, studying the younger man with the analytical gaze of someone who'd spent decades learning to read opponents. But there was no anger in his expression, no wounded pride. Instead, there was something that might have been sadness, or perhaps recognition. Look at this, Mason continued, his voice rising with each joke. This is from his 2019 masterpiece, Above the Law 47. This time it's personal. Watch this fight scene. I've seen arthritic turtles move faster. The screen showed a deliberately slowed down sequence, accompanied by cartoon sound effects that Mason's editors had added for maximum humiliation. Priya's pen tapped against her notepad in a nervous rhythm. She'd researched Steven Seagal's actual background, his legitimate martial arts credentials, his work with law enforcement, his efforts to mentor troubled youth. None of that would make it into tonight's segment. The audience wanted blood, and Mason was happy to provide it. But wait, there's more. Mason's voice took on the cadence of a carnival barker. Did you know Steven Seagal once claimed he taught Anderson Silva how to kick? That's right, the same Anderson Silva who's an actual professional fighter. It's like saying you taught Einstein how to count. The laughter was louder now, more vicious, feeding on itself. In the audience, Izzy Martinez felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd come here expecting to celebrate the heroes of her youth, the men who'd inspired her to take up martial arts, to find strength and discipline, and honor. Instead, she was watching them being torn apart for entertainment. Her friend Maria was laughing along with the crowd, but Izzy found herself studying the man in the third row. Something about his stillness, his dignity, felt important. And can we talk about those movies? Mason was building to a crescendo. Now, his gestures becoming more theatrical with each punchline. I mean, the man's made 47 direct-to-video movies, and in every single one, he saves the world while barely breaking a sweat. It's like watching Superman with a beer gut and a bad attitude. The camera operators dutifully captured the audience's reaction, phones held high, faces twisted with laughter, everyone performing their part in the grand theater of mockery. But Dante noticed something else in his monitors, a few uncomfortable expressions, people shifting in their seats, the kind of subtle body language that suggested not everyone was enjoying the blood sport. You know what kills me? Mason continued, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. These guys actually think they're still relevant. They're like those Japanese soldiers who didn't know World War II was over, except instead of hiding in caves, they're hiding in dojos, teaching soccer moms how to break boards with their feelings. Steven's hands remained folded in his lap, but his eyes had closed briefly, as if he were centering himself. When they opened again, there was something different there, not anger, but a kind of quiet determination, as if he'd reached some internal decision. I mean, seriously, Mason went on, his confidence growing with each laugh. These martial arts fossils can't even lift their own egos anymore. They're so washed up, they make the cast of Dancing with the Stars look like Olympic athletes. The audience was fully engaged now, their laughter building to a crescendo that would certainly generate the viral clips Mason craved. But in the production booth, something was changing. The social media comments were starting to shift, scattered. Voices pushing back against the mockery, asking why it was necessary to tear down people who'd brought joy to millions. "Oh, and here's my favorite part," Mason said, his eyes scanning the audience with predatory satisfaction. "Steven Seagal is so slow. His last fight scene had to be shot in slow motion just to make it look normal. I mean, the man moves like he's underwater, fighting opponents made of molasses." The laughter was reaching a fever pitch now, the audience fully invested in the performance. But something was about to shift, something that would transform the entire energy of the room. Because in the third row, Steven Seagal was beginning to stand, not in anger, not in defensiveness, but with the quiet dignity of someone who decided it was time to speak. The cameras, trained to catch every moment, began to focus on this unexpected development. And in that instant, the carefully orchestrated mockery was about to become something else entirely. The first person to notice was a production assistant monitoring the audience feeds. Her voice crackled through Dante's headset. "Camera 3. We've got movement in section 2. Guy standing up, third row left." Dante's eyes flicked to his monitors, and his breath caught. There, rising with the deliberate grace of someone who'd spent decades learning to move with purpose, was Steven Seagal himself. The man who'd been the target of Mason's vicious monologue was now standing in the middle of the audience, his presence transforming the entire dynamic of the room. "Holy shit," whispered a camera operator, forgetting his mic was live. "That's actually him." The audience began to notice the shift. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Phones that had been recording Mason's performance swiveled toward the unexpected figure in the third row. The laughter began to die, replaced by something else. Anticipation, uncertainty, the electric tension of a moment spinning out of control. Mason, still riding the wave of his own performance, hadn't noticed the change yet. He was building toward his next punchline, his back to the audience as he gestured at the screen. "And speaking of slow, I heard Steven Seagal's reflexes are so bad, he needs a 3 count to dodge a compliment." But the expected laughter didn't come. Instead, an uncomfortable silence settled over the studio, the kind of quiet that makes even seasoned performers falter. Mason turned, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching panic as he followed the audience's gaze. Steven Seagal stood completely still, his hands at his sides, his weathered face calm and unreadable. The baseball cap was still pulled low, but his eyes were visible now, dark and steady, fixed on Mason with the kind of attention that made the younger man's skin crawl. There was no anger there, no wounded pride, just a quiet intensity that seemed to see through all the lights and cameras and manufactured drama to something more fundamental. "Well," Mason said, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to recover his composure, "what do we have here? Looks like we've got a celebrity in the house." He forced his trademark grin, but it looked more like a grimace. "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears Steven Seagal is actually here with us tonight." The audience erupted in a different kind of noise now, not the orchestrated laughter of moments before, but the chaotic buzz of genuine surprise. Phones were everywhere, capturing every angle of the unexpected confrontation. Social media was exploding with real-time updates. "OMG, Seagal is there. This is insane. He's just standing there like a statue." In the production booth, panic was setting in. The executive producer was shouting into his headset, "What the hell is happening down there? Did anyone know he was coming?" But Dante was focused on his monitors, watching the subtle shifts in body language throughout the studio. This wasn't spiraling out of control. It was transforming into something else entirely. Priya leaned forward in her chair, her journalist's instincts kicking in. She'd covered enough breaking news to recognize a pivotal moment when she saw one. Her discomfort with the night's cruel tone was replaced by professional curiosity. Whatever was about to happen, it was going to be more significant than another viral roast. "Mr. Seagal," Mason called out, his voice carrying across the studio with forced joviality. "Thanks for being such a good sport about our little comedy segment. I hope you enjoyed the show." He was fishing for a reaction, hoping for either humiliation or anger, anything that would give him back control of the narrative. But Stephen didn't take the bait. Instead, he began to move, stepping carefully past the other audience members with the measured grace of someone who'd learned to navigate crowded spaces without disturbing the peace. His movement was unhurried, almost meditative, as if he were walking through a garden rather than a television studio buzzing with tension. Izzy Martinez watched with wide eyes as Stephen approached her row. For a moment, their eyes met, and she saw something that made her breath catch. Not the broken down has been that Mason had been mocking, but someone who carried himself with genuine dignity. The patch on her dojo bag seemed to pulse with significance as this real martial artist passed by. "You know," Stephen said as he reached the edge of the audience section, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent studio. "I came here tonight thinking I might learn something." His words were soft, conversational, but they carried the weight of someone who'd spent years learning to speak with precision. The studio's state-of-the-art sound system picked up every nuance, broadcasting his calm tone to millions of viewers, who were expecting either explosive anger or pathetic pleading. Mason's grin faltered completely. This wasn't going according to script. The mockery was supposed to be one-sided, safe, controlled. But Stephen's presence was transforming the entire dynamic, turning what should have been a comedy segment into something uncomfortably real. "I mean," Stephen continued, still moving with that unhurried grace, "I figured a young man with your platform, your reach, your obvious intelligence, you might have something interesting to say about strength, about what it means to be a warrior in the modern world." The audience was leaning forward now, caught between fascination and discomfort. This wasn't the explosive confrontation they'd expected. There was no shouting, no dramatic gestures, just a man speaking with quiet conviction in a room designed for spectacle. Dante found himself holding his breath, his finger hovering over the button that would cut to commercial. But something told him this was too important to interrupt. Whatever was happening here, it was bigger than their planned programming. "So tell me, Mason," Stephen said, his voice carrying just a hint of something that might have been amusement, "what do you think real strength looks like? Because I've got a feeling we might have different ideas about that." The question hung in the air like a challenge, but not the kind Mason had expected. This wasn't about physical confrontation or wounded pride. It was about something deeper, more fundamental. And in that moment, surrounded by cameras and lights and the hungry attention of millions, Mason Callahan realized he was facing something he'd never encountered before. Someone who couldn't be mocked, couldn't be reduced to a punchline, couldn't be controlled. The stage was set for a very different kind of performance. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Mason stood frozen in the harsh stage lights, his carefully crafted persona cracking like thin ice under pressure. The audience held its collective breath, phones raised, like a forest of electronic eyes capturing every nuance of the moment. Even the crew, trained to remain invisible during broadcasts, found themselves leaning forward in anticipation. Steven Seagal began walking toward the stage with the measured pace of someone who'd learned that true power never rushed. Each step was deliberate, grounded, carrying the weight of decades spent understanding the difference between performance and authenticity. He moved through the studio like he was walking through a meditation garden, unhurried by the chaos of lights and cameras around him. Mason started, then stopped, his trademark quick wit seeming to abandon him when faced with this unexpected challenge. His eyes darted to the teleprompter, but there was no script for this moment. For the first time in his career, he was flying blind, and it showed. "It's okay," Stephen said, his voice carrying easily through the studio's sound system. "Take your time. That's something I've learned. Rushing toward answers usually means you're running away from the right questions." The simplicity of the statement hit the audience like a physical force. These weren't the words of a washed-up has-been or a broken-down ego case. This was someone speaking from a place of hard-won wisdom, and the contrast with Mason's cruel mockery was stark. Priya felt a chill run down her spine. Her journalist's instincts were screaming that she was witnessing something unprecedented, a moment when entertainment was about to become education, when spectacle was about to transform into substance. She gripped her notepad tighter, ready to help guide this moment towards something meaningful. "Would you?" Mason's voice cracked, and he cleared his throat. "Would you like to come up here? To the stage?" The invitation tumbled out before he could stop it, born from a desperate need to regain some control over the situation. Stephen paused, considering the offer with the same careful attention he'd given to every movement since standing up. "If you'd like," he said finally. "But I should warn you, I'm not here to play the game you were expecting." The audience stirred, sensing the shift in energy. This wasn't going to be another humiliation, another viral moment built on someone else's pain. Something deeper was happening, something that made the studio's manufactured atmosphere feel suddenly sacred. Stephen stepped onto the stage with the same unhurried grace he'd shown throughout. Up close, under the harsh lights, his weathered face showed every year of his 68 years. But there was something in his eyes, a clarity, a presence, that made Mason's carefully maintained image seem fragile by comparison. "You know," Stephen said, accepting the microphone that a trembling stagehand offered him, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier. About strength, about warriors, about what it means to be relevant in today's world." Mason nodded frantically, desperate to find his footing. "Right, yes, that's what we do here. We examine these cultural phenomena, these icons. From the past." "Icons," Stephen repeated, tasting the word. "That's interesting, because I've never thought of myself as an icon. I'm just someone who spent his life trying to understand what it means to be strong." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The audience was completely silent now, caught up in the unexpected intimacy of the moment. Phones were still recording, but the quality of attention had changed. Instead of hunting for viral moments, people were actually listening. "And what I've learned," Stephen continued, his voice growing stronger, more certain, "is that real strength, the kind that matters, the kind that lasts, isn't about breaking things. It's about building them. It's about lifting people up, not tearing them down." Izzy Martinez felt tears spring to her eyes. This was why she'd fallen in love with martial arts. Not for the fighting, but for the philosophy behind it. The discipline, the respect, the way it taught you to be stronger so you could protect others, not hurt them. Dante watched from his position behind the cameras, his fingers still hovering over the commercial break button. But something in Stephen's presence, in the way he commanded attention without demanding it, made the stage manager realize that cutting away now would be a crime against something precious. "I came here tonight," Stephen said, his eyes finding Mason's and holding them, "not to be mocked, but maybe to remind us all, including myself, what real strength can look like. Because I've got a feeling we've forgotten, somewhere along the way." Mason's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. All his clever comebacks, all his prepared putdowns, seemed not just inadequate, but actively harmful in the face of this quiet dignity. For the first time in his career, he was confronting someone who couldn't be reduced to a punchline. Mason started again, and this time his voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with stage fright. "I guess we thought it was just comedy, just entertainment." "Just entertainment," Stephen repeated, a sad smile crossing his weathered features. "You know, I've heard that phrase a lot over the years. Usually right before someone does something that isn't very entertaining at all." The audience stirred, sensing the deeper currents running beneath the surface of this conversation. This wasn't just about comedy or entertainment, or even about respect for aging action stars. This was about something more fundamental, about how we treat each other, about what we choose to build up and what we choose to tear down. "But here's the thing about strength," Stephen continued, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent learning these lessons the hard way. "It's not about winning or losing. It's not about being the toughest guy in the room or the one with the sharpest tongue. It's about knowing when to stand up and when to step back, when to speak and when to listen." He paused, looking out at the audience with eyes that seemed to see each individual face, each personal story, each private struggle. "And right now," he said, his voice growing softer but somehow more powerful, "I'm thinking it's time we all learn to listen a little better." The studio had become a cathedral of attention, every person present feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was education, transformation, the kind of genuine human connection that the medium of television had been created to facilitate, but so rarely achieved. Mason stood there, his defenses crumbling, about to face a reckoning he'd never imagined possible. Steven Seagal stood in the center of the stage, the harsh television lights softening somehow in his presence. The microphone felt natural in his weathered hands, as if he'd been waiting his entire life for this moment to share what he'd learned. The audience sat in perfect silence, their phones still recording, but their attention completely focused on the man before them. "You want to know what real strength looks like?" Steven asked, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience. "Let me tell you about a girl I met 3 years ago in a small dojo outside Bangkok." Mason shifted uncomfortably, his usual quick wit feeling suddenly inadequate. He'd built his career on rapid-fire jokes and cutting observations, but Steven's deliberate pace demanded a different kind of attention, the kind that couldn't be rushed or manipulated. "Her name was Siraporn," Steven continued, his eyes distant as he recalled the memory. "She was 14 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and she came to the dojo with bruises she tried to hide under long sleeves. Her father brought her, said she needed to learn to defend herself. But I could see in her eyes that defense wasn't what she needed most." The studio had become a different kind of space entirely. The cameras kept rolling, but the frantic energy of manufactured entertainment had given way to something more sacred. Dante watched from his position behind the monitors, his finger no longer hovering over the commercial break button. Whatever was happening here was too important to interrupt. "The first time I tried to teach her a basic fall," Steven said, his voice growing softer, more intimate, "she froze completely. Not from fear of hitting the ground, from fear of getting back up. Because in her world, when you fell, when you showed weakness, bad things happened." Priya felt tears forming in her eyes. This wasn't the narrative she'd expected from tonight's show. She'd come prepared to fact-check jokes and provide scholarly counterpoints to Mason's mockery. Instead, she was witnessing something that felt like a masterclass in human compassion. "So we started differently," Steven continued. "Instead of teaching her to fight, I taught her to breathe. Instead of showing her how to strike, I showed her how to stand. And most importantly, I taught her that falling down wasn't failure, it was practice for getting back up." In the third row, Izzy Martinez felt her heart racing. This story was hitting too close to home, resonating with her own journey through illness and recovery. Her hand unconsciously moved to the small scar on her arm where the chemotherapy port had been, a reminder of her own battles with falling and rising. Week after week, she came to that dojo, Steven said, his voice carrying the rhythm of someone who'd told this story before, but never to an audience like this. And slowly, something changed. Not in her technique, that took months to develop, but in her spirit. She started to smile when she fell, because she knew she could get back up. Mason found himself leaning forward despite himself. This wasn't what he'd expected from the man he'd been mocking minutes earlier. The Steven Seagal on stage bore no resemblance to the caricature he'd created for his audience's entertainment. One day, about 6 months into her training, Steven continued, "She looked at me after a particularly good session and said something that changed my understanding of what strength really means. She said, 'Crew Steven, I'm not learning to fight. I'm learning to trust my body again.'" The audience stirred, sensing the deeper meaning behind the words. This wasn't about martial arts or self-defense or even overcoming abuse. This was about something more fundamental, about rebuilding trust in oneself, about learning to inhabit your own body with confidence and grace. "You see," Steven said, his eyes finding Mason's across the stage, "power isn't about breaking someone's will. It's not about making them smaller so you can feel bigger. Real power, the kind that lasts, the kind that matters, it's about teaching people how to stand." The words hit Mason like a physical blow. Every joke he'd told, every celebrity he'd mocked, every viral moment he'd created by tearing someone down, it all felt suddenly hollow, meaningless, actively harmful. "That girl," Steven continued, "taught me more about strength than 30 years of Hollywood action movies ever could. Because she showed me that the strongest thing you can do isn't to knock someone down, it's to help them get back up." Steven's eyes swept across the audience, taking in their faces, their expressions, their complete attention. These weren't the same people who'd been laughing at his expense 15 minutes earlier. Something had shifted, something fundamental. Every time she fell in training, she smiled a little more, Steven said, his voice growing stronger with each word. Not because falling was fun, but because she was learning that falling wasn't the end of the story. Getting back up was. And eventually, she stopped falling altogether. The silence in the studio was profound, the kind of quiet that comes when people are processing something that challenges their fundamental assumptions about the world. Social media was still buzzing with real-time reactions, but the tone had completely changed. Instead of mockery and cruel jokes, people were sharing stories of their own struggles, their own moments of falling and rising. The last time I saw Sarah porn, Stevens said, his voice carrying a note of pride that made the audience lean forward. She was teaching a class of her own. 8 young women, all dealing with their own challenges, all learning that strength isn't about never falling. It's about never staying down. Dante watched the metrics on his monitors in amazement. Viewership was climbing, but more importantly, the quality of engagement was unlike anything he'd seen in 15 years of television production. People weren't just watching, they were connecting, sharing, transforming. And that's when I realized, Stevens said, his eyes finding the camera that was broadcasting this moment to millions of homes, that real strength isn't something you use against people. It's something you use for them. It's about lifting others up, not tearing them down. It's about building bridges, not burning them. He paused, letting the words settle over the audience like a gentle rain on parched ground. Then, with the same deliberate grace he'd shown throughout the evening, Stephen began to move again, not away from the stage, but toward the audience, toward the people whose lives he'd just touched with his story. "And I see someone here tonight," he said, his eyes finding Izzy Martinez in the third row, "who understands exactly what I'm talking about." The camera followed his gaze, and suddenly Izzy found herself in the spotlight, her face flushed with emotion, her dojo bag clutched tightly in her hands. She was no longer just an audience member. She was part of the story, part of the lesson, part of the transformation that was happening in real time. Stephen's story had done more than entertain or educate. It had created a moment of genuine human connection, the kind that changes people, that makes them see the world differently. And as he extended his hand toward Izzy, inviting her to be part of something larger than herself, the entire studio held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Steven Seagal stepped down from the stage with the same measured grace he'd shown throughout the evening, his weathered hand extended toward Izzy Martinez. The 17-year-old sat frozen in her seat, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of terror and wonder. The camera operator, sensing the moment's significance, zoomed in on her face, capturing the raw emotion that no amount of scripting could manufacture. "It's okay," Stevens said, his voice carrying across the silent studio with gentle authority. "I can see in your eyes that you know what it means to fall and get back up. And I think these people could learn something from your story." Izzy's friend Maria nudged her gently, whispering, "Go on. This is incredible." But Izzy was already moving, her body responding to something deeper than conscious thought. She clutched her dojo bag tighter, the small Sunrise martial arts patch suddenly feeling like a badge of honor rather than just decoration. As she made her way to the front of the studio, her legs trembling slightly, the audience watched in respectful silence. This wasn't the manufactured drama they'd come to expect from television. This was something real, something that demanded their attention and respect. "What's your name?" Stephen asked as she approached, his voice warm and encouraging. "Isabella." "Martinez," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But everyone calls me Izzy." "Izzy," Stephen repeated, tasting the name. "And you train in martial arts?" She nodded, unconsciously touching the patch on her bag. "Karate. My sensei, he helped me through some tough times. He said the discipline would make me stronger." Mason watched from his position on the stage, feeling increasingly irrelevant in his own show. His carefully crafted persona, the quick wit, the cutting observations, the manufactured confidence, seemed not just inadequate, but actively harmful in the face of this genuine human connection. "Tell them about your tough times, Izzy," Stephen said gently, "if you're comfortable sharing." Izzy looked out at the audience, 300 faces that had been laughing at crude jokes about aging action stars just minutes before. Now they were looking at her with something approaching reverence, waiting to hear her story. "I had leukemia," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "When I was 15. The treatments they were really hard. I lost my hair, lost weight. Lost. I guess I lost myself for a while. The audience stirred, but it was different from their earlier reactions. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was education, transformation, the kind of genuine human connection that television had been. Created to facilitate, but so rarely achieved. The dojo raised money for my treatments. Izzy continued, her voice carrying more confidence now. Everyone pitched in, students, parents, even people who didn't know me. And when I was strong enough to come back, my sensei didn't treat me like I was broken. He treated me like I was a warrior. Stephen nodded, his eyes shining with something that might have been pride. And now? Now I'm cancer-free, Izzy said, her voice ringing with quiet triumph. 18 months and counting. And I help teach the younger kids at the dojo. I tell them that getting knocked down isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning of getting back up. The studio erupted in applause, but it was different from the manufactured enthusiasm of earlier. This was genuine, heartfelt, the kind of response that comes from witnessing real courage rather than performed bravado. But Stephen wasn't finished. As the applause died down, he turned his attention to another part of the studio, his eyes finding Dante Miller behind the cameras. The stage manager looked up from his monitors in surprise, unaccustomed to being noticed during a broadcast. You, Stephen said, his voice carrying easily across the studio. Behind camera 3. What's your name? Dante's radio crackled with confused chatter from the booth upstairs, but he ignored it. Something in Stephen's tone demanded honesty, demanded presence. Dante Miller, he said, stepping out from behind his equipment. I'm the stage manager. Dante, Stephen repeated, walking toward him with the same unhurried grace. How long have you been doing this work? 15 years, Dante replied, feeling suddenly exposed under the bright lights. Started as a production assistant, worked my way up. And what do you do when you're not here? Dante hesitated, and used to being the focus of attention. I take care of my mother. She's got arthritis, can't get around like she used to. And I'm trying to save money to go back to school. I want to direct theater, real theater, not television. Stephen smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered face. Real theater. And what makes theater real? It's about elevating people, Dante said, his voice growing stronger as he talked about his passion. It's about showing audiences something true, something that makes them think about their own lives differently. It's about building something beautiful instead of tearing things down. The parallel to Stephen's earlier story about strength wasn't lost on anyone in the studio. Here was another example of someone using their talents to lift others up, to build rather than destroy. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen said, turning back to address the audience and the cameras, I want you to look at these two people. Really, look at them. The cameras panned between Izzy, standing tall despite her slight frame, and Dante, his face flushed with emotion, but his eyes clear and determined. Izzy has faced down cancer and come out stronger. She's taken her pain and transformed it into purpose, using her experience to help others. And Dante has spent 15 years making other people's dreams come true while pursuing his own, all while caring for his mother with the kind of dedication that builds families and communities. Stephen's voice was growing stronger, more passionate. As he spoke, these are your heroes. Not the characters in movies, not the manufactured personalities on television, but the real people who get up every day and choose to build something better. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even Mason, standing forgotten on his own stage, found himself leaning forward, captured by the power of Stephen's message. They don't wear capes or have special powers, Stephen continued. They don't have publicists or social media managers or carefully crafted images. They just get up again and again and do the work that needs to be done. They fall down and they get back up. They face challenges that would break most people, and they keep going. He paused, letting his words settle over the audience like a blanket of truth. These are the people who keep the world running, Stephen said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Not the ones who mock and tear down, but the ones who build and lift up. Not the ones who seek attention, but the ones who do the work. He looked directly into the camera, speaking to the millions of viewers watching at home. In every community, in every workplace, in every family, there are people like Izzy and Dante. People who choose service over self-interest, who choose building over breaking, who choose love over fear. The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic outside, the subtle electronic whisper of the cameras recording this moment for posterity. "And if we're smart," Steven said, his voice growing, softer but somehow more powerful, "we'll stop looking for heroes in all the wrong places and start recognizing them in all the right ones." He extended his arms, embracing both Izzy and Dante in a gesture that somehow included the entire audience, the entire viewing public, the entire world of people who were watching this moment unfold. "Let's give them the applause they deserve," he said simply. And as the studio erupted in the most genuine ovation any of them had ever heard, Steven Seagal stood quietly at the center of it all, having transformed a house of mockery into a celebration of the human spirit. The applause seemed to last forever, washing over the studio in waves of genuine emotion. But as it gradually died down, a different kind of silence settled over the space, expectant, charged with possibility. All eyes turned back to Mason Callahan, still standing on his stage, looking suddenly small and lost in the harsh television lights. Steven Seagal remained near the front of the audience, his arms still around Izzy and Dante, but his attention had shifted back to the man who'd started this entire journey with his cruel jokes and manufactured outrage. There was no triumph in Steven's expression, no sense of victory over a defeated opponent. Instead, there was something that looked almost like compassion. Mason cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the studio's sound system like a gunshot. His trademark confidence had completely evaporated, leaving behind a man who looked younger than his 32 years, vulnerable and uncertain. Mason started, then stopped, his voice cracking. The teleprompter offered no guidance for this moment. His writers, his producers, his entire team, they prepared him for mockery, for viral moments, for the kind of manufactured controversy that drove ratings and social media engagement. But they'd never prepared him for this. "It's okay," Steven said, his voice carrying easily across the studio. "Take your time. Sometimes the most important things are the hardest to say." Mason's hands were shaking as he gripped the microphone. For the first time in his career, he was facing something that couldn't be dismissed with a clever quip or defused with a well-timed joke. The weight of his own words, his own actions, his own choices was pressing down on him like a physical force. "I thought," Mason began again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it was just entertainment. Just comedy. People laughed. The ratings were good. Everyone seemed to enjoy it." "Did they?" Steven asked, his tone gentle but probing. "Or did they just get used to it?" The question hung in the air, like a challenge. Mason looked out at his audience, the same 300 people who'd been laughing at his jokes about aging action stars just 20 minutes earlier. But their faces were different now. Instead of the eager anticipation of spectacle, he saw something else. Expectation, yes, but also disappointment, sadness, and perhaps most devastatingly, pity. "I don't know," Mason admitted, his voice growing stronger even as his facade crumbled. "I honestly don't know anymore. I used to think I was giving people what they wanted. But maybe I was just giving them what I thought they deserved." Priya Rao felt her heart break a little for her co-host. She'd watched Mason's career trajectory, seen how the pressure to go viral, to trend, to capture attention in an increasingly crowded media landscape had gradually hardened him into something she barely recognized. The man she'd first worked with 3 years ago had possessed genuine curiosity about the world, real intelligence, and even flashes of empathy. But somewhere along the way, he'd learned that cruelty got more clicks than kindness. "Mason," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly through the studio's microphones. "Remember when we first started working together? You did that piece about the teacher in Newark who was buying school supplies with her own money?" Mason's eyes found hers across the studio, and for a moment his expression softened. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, remembering. "She was spending her grocery money on pencils and notebooks for her kids. And you raised $15,000 for her classroom." Priya continued. "People watching the show sent money, supplies, letters of support. You changed her life and the lives of her students." "That was different," Mason said, but his voice lacked conviction. That was a feel-good story. People like those. People like truth," Steven interjected, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent decades learning the difference between performance and authenticity. They like genuine human connection. They like being reminded that there's still good in the world. Mason's shoulders sagged as if a great weight was settling on them. The studio lights felt harsher suddenly, exposing every flaw, every crack, in the carefully maintained facade he'd built around himself. But that doesn't get the same ratings, Mason said, his voice carrying a note of desperation. The network wants controversy, wants viral moments, wants content that people will share and argue about. Nice stories about teachers don't trend on social media. No, Stephen agreed, they don't. But they do something more important. They remind people what's worth fighting for. The silence that followed was deafening. Mason stood there, exposed and vulnerable, facing the reality of what he'd become. The man who'd built his career on tearing others down was finally forced to confront the cost of his choices. I used to want to be a journalist, Mason said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if he couldn't stop them. Real journalism, like Priya did. I wanted to tell stories that mattered, that made a difference. But somewhere along the way, I got scared. Scared of what? Stephen asked. Of being irrelevant, Mason admitted, his voice barely audible. Of being forgotten. Of not matching. So I started going for the easy laughs, the cheap shots, the stuff that would get people talking. And the more I did it, the easier it became, until you forgot who you were underneath all the performance, Stephen finished gently. Mason nodded, tears forming in his eyes. I look at Izzy, at Dante, at you, people who've found something worth standing for, and I realize I don't know what I stand for anymore. I don't know who I am when I'm not trying to be clever or cutting or controversial. The audience watched in fascination as one of television's most confident performers completely stripped away his defenses. This wasn't the kind of manufactured vulnerability that drove ratings. This was real, raw, and somehow beautiful in its honesty. You know what I think? Stephen said, moving closer to the stage. I think you're still that journalist who wanted to tell stories that mattered. I think he's still in there, underneath all the fear and performance and pressure. And I think tonight might be the night he finally gets to come out. Mason looked down at his hands, still trembling slightly as they gripped the microphone. I don't know if I remember how to be that person anymore. Then learn, Stephen said simply. Start over. Use this platform, this audience, this moment. Use it to build something instead of tearing it down. Use it to lift people up instead of bringing them down. Mason's eyes swept across the studio, taking in the faces of his audience, his crew, his colleagues. For the first time in years, he wasn't calculating their reactions or planning his next move. He was simply present, simply human, simply afraid and hopeful and uncertain all at once. I want to try, he said, his voice growing stronger. I want to be better than this. I want to be someone my mother would be proud of, someone who adds something good to the world instead of just taking from it. Stephen smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Then you're already halfway there. The hardest part isn't learning to be better, it's admitting you need to be. And in that moment, as Mason Callahan stood stripped of his defenses and false confidence, he looked more like a real person than he had in years. The transformation wasn't complete, might never be complete, but it had begun. And sometimes, Stephen had learned, beginning was enough. Steven Seagal reached into the inside pocket of his simple black jacket with the same deliberate grace he'd shown throughout the evening. The studio watched in fascination as he withdrew a small, plain business card. Nothing fancy, just white cardstock with simple black lettering. It seemed almost anticlimactic after everything that had happened, but something about the gesture carried weight that made the entire audience lean forward. Mason, Stephen said, his voice carrying the warm authority of someone who'd spent decades learning to guide others toward their better selves. I want you to have this. Mason stepped down from the stage, his movements uncertain, like someone learning to walk again after a long illness. The confidence that had carried him through thousands of broadcasts, millions of viral moments, had completely evaporated, leaving behind someone who looked younger, more vulnerable, more human. Stephen extended the card, and Mason took it with hands that trembled slightly. The simple gesture felt monumental, witnessed by 300 people in the studio and millions more watching at home. Mason stared down at the card, reading the simple text printed there. Sunrise Martial Arts, he read aloud, his voice carrying easily through the studio's sound system. Teaching discipline, respect, and service to others. It's not my dojo, Stephen explained, his eyes finding Izzy Martinez in the small group, gathered near the front of the studio. It belongs to someone much wiser than me. But they've got something there that I think you need to learn. Izzy's face flushed with emotion, her hand unconsciously moving to the patch on her dojo bag. The connection between her story and Stephen's message was clicking into place, creating a web of meaning that encompassed everyone in the studio. What would I learn there? Mason asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than the performative interest he'd perfected for television. How to fall down and get back up, Stephen replied. How to be strong enough to lift others instead of pushing them down. How to turn your pain into purpose, your fear into service. Mason's eyes filled with tears as he looked at the card. Such a simple thing. A piece of paper with an address and phone number, but it represented something he'd lost years ago without even realizing it was gone. I don't know if I'm ready, Mason admitted, his voice cracking. I don't know if I can be the person you think I could be. Nobody's ever ready, Stephen said gently. That's what makes it brave. But here's what I've learned in 68 years of making mistakes and trying to fix them. The only failure is not trying. At all. The studio was completely silent, 300 people holding their breath as they watched this moment unfold. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was education, transformation, the kind of genuine human connection that reminded everyone present why they'd fallen in love with storytelling in the first place. When you're ready, Stephen continued. When you've decided you want to learn how to use your platform to build instead of tear down, to lift instead of push down, to serve instead of just perform, call that number. Ask for Sensei Martinez. Izzy gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My sensei? You know my sensei? Stephen's weathered face broke into a warm smile. Carlos Martinez has been a friend for 20 years. He's the one who taught me most of what I shared with you tonight. He's the one who showed me that real strength isn't about what you can break, it's about what you can build. The connections were forming, creating a web of meaning that encompassed everyone in the studio. Izzy's dojo, Stephen's journey, Mason's transformation, all of it was connected, all of it was part of something larger than any individual story. He knows you're here tonight, Stephen continued, his eyes twinkling with something that might have been mischief. He's been watching the broadcast, and he's very proud of how you represented everything he taught you. Izzy burst into tears, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. Her sensei, watching her stand up in front of millions of people and share her story of falling and rising. It was more than she'd ever imagined possible. Dante Miller stepped forward, his years of stage management experience forgotten in the face of this extraordinary moment. What about the rest of us? He asked, his voice carrying the hope of someone who'd spent too many years making other people's dreams come true while his own gathered dust. Stephen turned to face him, his expression serious but kind. The offer isn't just for Mason. It's for anyone who's tired of settling for less than they could be. Anyone who wants to learn how to turn their struggles into strength, their pain into purpose. He looked out at the audience, at the crew members who'd stopped pretending to work and were listening with rapt attention, at the millions of viewers watching at home. Every community has a place like Sunrise Martial Arts, Stephen said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Maybe it's a dojo, maybe it's a community center, maybe it's a church or a school, or just a group of people who've decided to help each other be better. The important thing isn't where you find it, it's that you look for it. Mason clutched the business card tighter, as if it were a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. What if I call that number and I can't follow through? What if I'm too weak, too selfish, too set in my ways? Then you'll fail, Stephen said simply. And then you'll get back up and try again. That's what strength really is, not never falling, but never staying down. The echo of his earlier story about Siraporn, about Izzy's journey through cancer, about Dante's quiet dedication to his family and dreams, it all came together. In this moment, creating a symphony of human resilience that made everyone in the studio feel like they were witnessing something sacred. I want to try, Mason said, his voice growing stronger with each word. I want to be someone who builds instead of breaks, who lifts instead of pushes down. I want to be worthy of this second chance. Stephen stepped closer, placing a weathered hand on Mason's shoulder. then you're already on your way. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, and you've already taken it. The studio erupted in applause, but it was different from any ovation Mason had ever received. This wasn't about his performance or his cleverness or his ability to generate viral moments. This was about his humanity, his vulnerability, his willingness to admit he'd been wrong and commit to being better. As the applause continued, Stephen looked around the studio one more time, taking in the faces of everyone who'd been touched by this unexpected evening. Izzy, still crying but smiling through her tears. Dante, standing straighter than he had in years. Priya, her eyes shining with the kind of hope that had first drawn her to journalism. The crew members, the audience, the millions of viewers at home, all of them connected by this moment of genuine human transformation. The choice isn't just Mason's, Stephen said, his voice carrying easily over the continuing applause. It's yours too. Every day, in every interaction, in every moment when you have the power to build or destroy, to lift or tear down, to serve or just perform, the choice is yours. He paused, letting the weight of that truth settle over everyone present. Choose wisely, he said simply. The world is watching. And more importantly, you're watching. You have to live with the person you choose to be. And with that, Steven Seagal stepped back, his part in this extraordinary evening complete. He'd come to the studio as a target for mockery and had become something else entirely. A teacher, a guide, a reminder that transformation was always possible for those brave enough to choose it. The business card in Mason's hand felt warm, alive with possibility. A phone number, an address, and the promise of something better. It was, he realized, exactly what he'd been searching for without knowing it. The choice, as Stephen had said, was his. Steven Seagal moved with the same unhurried grace he'd shown throughout the evening, stepping back from the small group gathered at the front of the studio. But instead of returning to his seat, he walked toward the center aisle, his weathered face calm and contemplative. The audience watched in fascination as he paused, looking out at the sea of faces that had been transformed by the past hour. "I want to tell you something," Steven said, his voice carrying easily through the studio's sound system. "When I walked in here tonight, I expected to be mocked. I expected to be made into a punchline, a viral moment, something for people to laugh at and forget." The audience stirred, some looking uncomfortable as they remembered their own laughter from earlier. In the evening, the phones that had been raised to capture moments of mockery now felt heavy in their hands, weighted with the recognition of what they'd been complicit in. But something different happened, Stephen continued. Instead of finding a room full of people hungry for cruelty, I found a room full of people hungry for connection, for truth, for something real in a world that's forgotten what real looks like. One by one, audience members began to stand. It started with an elderly man in the back row, his weathered hands gripping the seat in front of him as he pulled himself upright. Then a young woman near the middle, tears streaming down her face. Then another, and another, until the entire studio was rising in a wave of spontaneous respect. Dante Miller watched from behind his cameras, his radio crackling, with confused chatter from the production booth. The executive producer was demanding explanations, wanting to know if this was planned, if it was part of some elaborate publicity stunt. But Dante understood what was happening better than anyone. He'd spent 15 years watching manufactured moments, orchestrated emotions, calculated responses. This was different. This was real. "Keep the cameras rolling," he whispered into his headset, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd found his moral center. "This is more important than any script we ever wrote." Priya Rao felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the transformation unfold. This was why she'd become a journalist in the first place, not for the headlines or the bylines, but for moments like this when truth broke through the noise and reminded people of their shared humanity. She looked at Mason, standing with Steven's business card clutched in his hands, and saw not the cynical performer she'd worked with for 3 years, but the idealistic young man who'd first dreamed of using media to make the world better. "You see this?" Steven said, gesturing to the standing audience. "This is what happens when people remember they're not just consumers of entertainment, they're participants in the human story. They're not just watching life happen, they're living it." The crew members, trained to remain invisible during broadcasts, began to emerge from behind their equipment. Camera operators stepped out from behind their lenses, sound technicians removed their headphones, lighting technicians looked up from their boards. For the first time in years, they were seeing the show they helped create from the outside, and what they saw moved them to join the standing ovation. Izzy Martinez stood tall among the crowd, her slight frame somehow commanding attention despite her youth. The dojo patch on her bag caught the studio lights, a small symbol of the larger truth Steven had shared, that real strength came not from dominance, but from service, not from breaking others, but from building them up. I came here tonight thinking I was just another aging action star, Steven said, his voice carrying the weight of profound realization. But I learned something from all of you. I learned that the real action heroes aren't on movie screens. They're right here, right now, choosing every day to be better than they were yesterday. The applause that followed was unlike anything the studio had ever hosted. It wasn't the manufactured enthusiasm of a television audience or the calculated response of fans meeting their idol. It was the deep, sustained recognition of people who'd witnessed something that changed them, something that reminded them of who they could be at their best. Mason Callahan looked out at his audience, truly looked at them, perhaps for the first time in his career. He saw the elderly man who'd stood first, recognizing in his weathered face the same dignity Steven carried. He saw the young woman, with tears on her cheeks, understanding that her emotion came from being seen, being valued, being reminded that her story mattered. He saw Dante, his loyal stage manager, beaming with pride at being acknowledged as more than just part of the machinery. "You've given me something tonight that I didn't even know I needed," Mason said, his voice carrying over the continuing applause. "You've given me permission to be human again, to make mistakes and learn from them, to fall down and get back up, to use this platform for something bigger than my own ego." The cameras captured every moment, broadcasting this unprecedented display of genuine human connection to millions of homes across the country. Social media exploded with responses, but the tone was completely different from the cruel mockery that had characterized the show's usual viral moments. People were sharing their own stories of falling and rising, of finding strength in unexpected places, of being reminded that their struggles had meaning. Steven watched it all with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd seen his deepest beliefs confirmed. Real strength wasn't about physical prowess or martial arts mastery. It was about the courage to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, to choose connection over isolation. It was about recognizing that every person carried within them the potential for greatness, if only they were reminded of their own worth. As the applause finally began to die down, Steven looked around the studio one more time. The harsh television lights seemed softer somehow. The sterile set transformed into something that felt almost sacred. This was what he'd spent his life searching for, not movie stardom or fame or recognition, but the opportunity to remind people of their own strength, their own dignity, their own capacity for transformation. The studio had awakened, and it would never be the same. The production team called for a brief intermission, but the energy in the studio remained electric. When the cameras rolled again, Mason Callahan sat in his host's chair with a composure that was completely different from his earlier performance. The business card Steven had given him rested on the desk beside him, a simple reminder of the choice he'd made to be better. "We're back," Mason said, his voice carrying none of the manufactured enthusiasm that had characterized his previous broadcasts. Instead, there was something more valuable: authenticity. "And I have to be honest with you. This isn't the show any of us expected tonight." Priya sat beside him, her eyes bright with the kind of hope she'd thought television had killed. In her years ago, the woman who'd joined the show to bring substance to Mason's style had found something she'd never expected: a partner who was finally ready to match her commitment to meaningful journalism. "Tonight," Mason continued, "I learned something about myself that I didn't want to see. I learned that I've been using this platform, this incredible opportunity to reach millions of people, to tear down instead of build up, to mock instead of celebrate, to destroy instead of create." The audience listened in rapt attention, the same 300 people who'd come expecting cheap laughs, now witnessing something far more valuable: a human being choosing to be better in real time. "Steven Seagal came here tonight and could have responded to my mockery with anger, with violence, with the kind of confrontation that would have made great television, Mason said, his voice growing stronger with each word. Instead, he chose to teach us something about real strength, about what it means to be a warrior in the truest sense of the word. Stephen remained in his seat in the third row, his weathered face calm and attentive. He'd done his part, shared his story, offered his wisdom. Now it was time for others to decide what they would do with it. He reminded us that strength isn't about never falling. It's about never staying down, Mason continued. That real power comes from lifting others up, not pushing them down. That the true heroes in our society aren't the ones seeking attention, but the ones quietly doing the work that keeps the world running. Izzy Martinez sat straighter in her chair, her dojo bag clutched in her hands like a talisman. She'd come to the studio as a fan hoping to see her heroes celebrated. Instead, she discovered that she was a hero herself, that her struggle with cancer and her dedication to helping others had more value than any movie role. "We met Izzy tonight," Mason said, his eyes finding hers in the audience. A 17-year-old who faced down leukemia and came out stronger, who now uses her experience to help younger students at her dojo. And we met Dante Miller, our stage manager, who spent 15 years making other people's dreams come true while pursuing his own goal of directing meaningful theater. Dante stepped forward slightly, still behind his cameras, but no longer invisible. The recognition felt strange after years of being part of the background, but it also felt right. His work mattered. His dreams mattered. He mattered. "These are the real action heroes," Mason said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd finally found his purpose. Not the fictional characters on screens, but the real people who choose every day to be better, to serve others, to turn their pain into purpose. The studio erupted in applause, but Mason raised his hand gently, not to stop it, but to add something more important. "Starting next week," he announced, "this show is going to be different. Instead of tearing people down, we're going to build them up. Instead of mocking those who've fallen, we're going to celebrate those who've gotten back up. Instead of looking for the worst in people, we're going to search for the best." Priya smiled, her eyes shining with tears of relief and joy. This was the journalism she'd always dreamed of, storytelling that elevated rather than diminished, that reminded people of their capacity for good rather than their appetite for cruelty. "We're going to find the Izzies and the Dantes in every community," Mason continued. "The teachers spending their own money on school supplies, the neighbors helping elderly residents, the volunteers at food banks, the mentors at youth centers. The people who keep the world running not because they have to, but because they choose to." The audience stood again, but this time the ovation felt different, not like the end of a show, but like the beginning of something new. Steven Seagal watched from his seat, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The seed had been planted. Whether it grew would depend on the choices people made in the days and weeks to come. "I want to thank Steven Seagal for coming here tonight," Mason said as the applause died down. "Not just for enduring my mockery with grace, but for showing us what real strength looks like, what real heroism means, what real change is possible when we choose to be better." Steven stood slowly, acknowledging the recognition with a slight nod. He'd accomplished what he'd come to do, though he'd never expected the evening to unfold as it had. As he made his way toward the exit, he paused at Izzy's row. "Tell your sensei I said hello," he said softly. "And tell him he's raised a warrior." Izzy nodded, unable to speak through her tears. She watched as Steven walked up the aisle and out of the studio, leaving behind a room full of people who'd been forever changed by his presence. "That's our show for tonight," Mason said, his voice carrying a weight and dignity it had never possessed before. "Thank you for being part of something special. Thank you for reminding us that entertainment can be more than just distraction. It can be transformation." As the credits rolled, the studio remained standing, applauding not just the show, but the possibility it represented. The harsh television lights seemed softer now. The sterile set transformed into something that felt almost sacred. Mason looked down at the business card on his desk, then up at the audience that had witnessed his transformation. Tomorrow, he would make the call. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of becoming someone worthy of the second chance he'd been given. The quiet storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape forever changed. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.